Well, hello and welcome to our third week together in the project course. As you know, we're continuing our journey. We started by talking about how to effectively write manuscripts and tell the story of the practice transformational work that you're doing. And we've looked at the ancient Greek narrative arc with a 5-part structure where we begin with an exposition, you get hooked in the narrative hook, you take the reader through your rising action, climax, falling action, and then your resolution and conclusion. And we saw how powerfully that structure can help us think about the story of our own DNP manuscript. So this week what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the issue that you're working on in your project drives the design. There are so many different study designs and project designs that you could use. You could be looking at quality improvement, observational studies, qualitative studies, randomized clinical trials, step wedge crossover designs, and the list can go on and on and on. And what we're going to focus on is how the issue that you're dealing with drives the design of your DNP project, and then that design puts you in a scientific community. You're not alone in using that type of design. There are hundreds and thousands of other authors who have used similar designs, and there's some guidelines about how to report on different types of projects. And so we're going to give you a case example using the Squire guidelines and the Strobe guidelines. And then finally we're going to talk about authorship and the ethics around contributing to a project and a manuscript as an author. What counts as authorship? When do you recognize people for their contributions and a thank you? And when do you include them as an author in the manuscript or the abstract that you're presenting? And as you go throughout this material, there are the Nature Master classes that I'd highly encourage you to listen to. These are powerful resources from very accomplished authors, practice transformers, and researchers that can help you think about the issues. For example, in this week around authorship, and other weeks about the introduction section of your manuscript or the methods or the analysis. And by using those tools in the Nature Master class, it can give you an overview of how to think about that issue for your own manuscript. So as you think about the reporting guidelines, first you have to think about what type of project are you doing, what type of inquiry are you conducting. Because that type of inquiry is what guides the reporting. And so as you think about your DNP project, you may be at the place where you can, ramble off the design of your project. This is a randomized clinical trial. This is a step wedge design crossover inquiry. This is an observational study. This is a report on routinely collected chart data in the EHR system. Whatever type of study design you have is going to guide how you then summarize your findings to be interpretable for the scholarly community. And if you're still in the process of thinking about what design you are using or you have used to collect your data, have a conversation with your DNP team, or certainly reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you think that through, because that's the first step that you have to go through before you pick what reporting guidelines to use. And so we're going to look at the Equator Network. This is a vast network of reporting guidelines based on study design, where you can, if you know what guideline you need, you can go and search for it. If you're not sure, there's some tools there to help you decide what type of design you're using. And we're going to then go to this Equator Network so you can see how do you go to find the guidelines that tell you how to report on the study or project that you've conducted, because many journals require you to report in standard guidelines. And so this is work that you would have to do. You have to weave it into your manuscript before you submit for publication. So you can see here that Equator Network is a vast library, and some common designs are listed here on the front page. For example, if you're doing a randomized clinical trial, you have the consort diagram and reporting guidelines that are the most commonly used. If you're reporting on the experience of managing one particular patient case, you might be using the CARE guidelines. Many are doing quality improvement work, so you could use the Squire guidelines. And you can search this database for additional resources. You can see there are 409 reporting guidelines that you have access to in this network. So if you begin with quality improvement, you can see here, if you select the Squire guidelines, it brings you to a page. And once you're on this page, then you can select the Squire checklist. So these are the standards, Squire 2.0, for reporting quality improvement research or studies in scholarly publications. They tell you how to structure your title, things that you need to have in your abstract, that you have to include the problem description, have to talk about what's known about the problem currently, provide a rationale, specific aims for your work, describing the context, the intervention that you're using, what you're measuring, and then how you go about analyzing your data. You have to talk about the ethics of your work, and then describe your results in specific ways, and then talk about the meaning of your findings with a summary and then an interpretation for the intervention, its impact on the system, and talking about how your findings relate to other findings from other settings. You have to explain specific things about the limitations, include the conclusions or the so what, and then your funding sources. So you can see here, this provides you essentially a core structure for your manuscript based on a quality improvement approach. If you're doing work that is observational, so you're not conducting an intervention, you're just describing something about a patient population over time or a clinical unit over time, for example, without an intervention, then you would use the Strobe guidelines. And there are various subtypes of Strobe guidelines based on what you're looking at. So you can see back here on the Equator site, if you're doing observational studies, you can select the Strobe guidelines. So once you go to the Strobe page, you can see this is the strengthening of reporting of observational studies in epidemiology, the Strobe statement. Now, the general checklists are listed at the beginning. So if you're doing a cohort study where you're following a group of people over time, there's a Strobe guideline for that. If you're doing case control studies where you're looking at people who develop a disease, disorder, or problem and comparing them to others, there's a guideline for that. If you're doing a cross-sectional study, you're just describing something at one point in time, there's a guideline for that. So, and then there's a combined guideline that's more generic. So if you download this generic Strobe checklist, you can see it has similar pieces to the Squire guidelines where it talks to you about what you need to include in your title and abstract, what needs to go into the introduction section, things that need to go in the methods about what your study design is, the setting, participants, who's coming into your work, who's being excluded, what the variables are, how you're getting your data, potential sources of bias, how you determine your study size, looking at the nature of variables and specific statistical approaches that you used. It asks you to describe the participants in your results section, giving some descriptive information about them from race, ethnicity, demographic characteristics, looking at the outcomes that you're measuring, primary results, secondary results, and then you move into your discussion section where you talk about how your results match with your objectives. What are the limitations of your work? How do you interpret it? What does this mean? So what? And how important or valid are these findings for other groups or settings, and discussing funding. So you can see there are 22 items that you would use in a Strobe guideline reporting. So when you look at the instructions for authors in your journal and it says tells you the different study types and what guidelines you need to use to report, this is where you can go, the Equator Network. So I've included links to Squire for quality improvement and Strobe for observational studies. And you can search Equator to find additional guidelines if your DMP project isn't captured with either one of those approaches. You can certainly, as I said, work with me or your DMP team to find the guidelines that fit your DMP project design if you're not already familiar with those. So let's say you're doing a cross-sectional study. So it's observational. You're just taking data at one point in time. You can use the Strobe guidelines for cross-sectional studies. And you would know what's required by your journal by looking at the journal guidelines. So we're going to take a case example of PLOS One, which has a broad readership in a variety of fields. So I'll give you an example of one specific journal and how they give instructions to their authors about how you write your paper in a way so that they can review it. So on your journal website, you should have information that tells you as an author how to submit your paper. So on PLOS One, you can see here under Publish, there's information on submission guidelines. So you can select that, and it's going to tell you, you can see step by step, what's required for your manuscript to be reviewed by them. And PLOS is very expansive in what they include. They tell you about the format of the file, that the length of the manuscript is governed by the type that you're submitting. It's about the fonts, headings, layout, page number, footnotes. So all the overview here, it tells you how to organize your manuscript, what goes in, what titles you use. You can see as you go forward, it gives you a policy on authorship. Who is an author and who gets acknowledged. It tells you about the role of the corresponding author or the first author, which would generally be you as the DMP scholar. And it tells you that you have to use the credit methodology to attribute authorship. You have to go through a credit checklist. Include a cover letter, a title page, the abstract, the sections of your manuscript. So you can see there's way more reading perhaps than you ever wanted to do here, but it gives you very specific steps. And oftentimes one of the main reasons manuscripts are rejected is because they simply don't follow the guidelines for the author. So as you're in the preparation of your manuscript, when you're early in the preparation stage, you absolutely have to invest the time to internalize and understand these guidelines so you can submit something that's reviewable, that targets the audience of interest, captures the attention of your reviewer so that you can have your findings shared and disseminated to protect patient and population well-being. So on our course website, if you go to the reading section, there's information here about the ICMJE Guidelines for Ethical Authorship, then the credit grid, which helps you take and operationalize who is an author, and then there's the Emory Credit Grid that helps you think about who has contributed what and how do you list them as authors. There are also direct links here to some of the common study designs. There are research manuscripts that talk about different types of designs so you could clarify what needs to go into your own project. And there are some additional optional Nature Masterclasses on authorship and selecting journals. Excellent, excellent tools to use. So I highly encourage you to tap into those. So to help you make sense of all of the requirements for reporting that journals typically ask for, there's Table 1 in the DMP project manuscript template. And in that template, it gives you a place to talk about authorship. What are the guidelines for the authors? How do you attribute contribution? What's required for the corresponding author? How do you acknowledge contributions who aren't authors? What's required for a cover letter? The manuscript, tables, figures, abstracts, other general information about submission, cost, impact factor, ethical protections, copywriting. So this one page summarizes critical portions for you as you think about writing your manuscript for this journal. So that's an assignment this week, is to review the author guidelines and complete this table.